Sputnik was a satellite launched by the USSR in October of 1957. All it did was beep, and as it orbited the Earth about once every 90 minutes or so, but it set off a storm. And that storm would last for 2 decades. It scared people. It scared them to death. Department of Defense went back and got funding because the U.S. was behind. We needed to catch up with the USSR. And that sparked a whole raft of funding that went off to, it started NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It also started the National Science Foundation, which was designed to try to fund science projects to help build the technologies that were going to be needed by the space program. It also added additional funding to ARPA. Now, ARPA was already a thing, and in fact, they were busy working on the beginnings of ARPANET at the time when all of this started to happen. Also came out of it were the plasma display. That made it possible to create graphical user interfaces that were able to persist for long periods of time. It was a breakthrough technology. And the other part of it was the touch panel. The touch panel it was funny that it was actually developed in the 60s. Steve Jobs reintroduced it as part of the first iPhone.
We're going to use the best pointing device in the world. We're going to use a pointing device that we're all born with. We're born with 10 of them. We're going to use our fingers.
We already knew that. We already knew that. How did we get from Sputnik and we get from the plasma panel and the touch screen? How do we get to, wait a minute, all these technologies that we use today, guess what? They all came from Plato. The first thing they needed was a name. And they came up originally with program logic for automated teaching operations. But during the discussion, Paul, who was a linguist, pointed out that you can't use automated. And they said, why not? Well, it means self-mated. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't work in that context. So they said, oh, okay. So what do you suggest? He said, how about just using the word automatic? So it became program logic for automatic teaching operations. I noticed that in some of the literature today, you still see the original name, but that's not what it was called. It was called program logic for automatic teaching operations, not automated. So if you know an insider, they'll tell you that. One of the things that Dr. Bitzer was just one of these amazing people that could solve problems quickly. There would be people working on something for months at a time that couldn't figure out how to do something. He was one of those amazing geniuses that could walk up, look at it, and in 10 minutes go, well, or maybe, a few hours, click, and he had the answer, and he had the right answer. He realized that a single terminal was not going to help them understand all the problems that they would likely find when they began scaling this thing up. There had to be other problems, and so he suggested we needed to add a second terminal to the machine and see what happens, and then see what problems come up. Well, they quickly discovered that they wanted a response time of about 1/10 of a second, and they weren't getting it. So they quickly realized they needed a time-sharing operating system to support it. They wrote one. That was the first time-sharing operating system that was ever built. It never became patented, so they never got credit for the time-sharing. They also realized that this was not going to be enough of a system to be able to support an entire classroom. And they couldn't expand the ILIAC. It was limited to 2 terminals, and that was mainly because of the limitations of memory and the way memory worked on that machine. So they couldn't really use it there. This was all before my time. I wasn't even on campus yet when all this was happening. So in 63 or 64, they went out for bid and they purchased. They had a bid between IBM and Control Data at the finalists, but Control Data beat them out on the price. They called it Plato 3, and they quickly expanded it to 20 terminals, but the terminals they were building were very expensive. They required a type of display tube that cost a lot of money. So they needed something better. They realized that they had limited communication paths on the machine. And to be able to utilize things better, they were going to have to put multiple terminals on each communication line. The second problem they had to solve was they needed a way to reduce the amount of traffic coming down that line, because the more you can reduce it, obviously the more terminals you could put on. They came up with the idea to go to a display panel. Why a display panel? It had memory. Memory was integral to part of the plasma display. Unfortunately, there wasn't such a device that existed, so they had to invent it, and so they did. The other problem that they ran into was that none of the teachers wanted to use the programming language that had been used on Plato 1 and 2. It was called Cato, which was Compiler for Automatic Teaching Operations. It was just too hard for the educators to use. They didn't understand computer languages, and so Paul Tenzar, who was a biologist, developed a language called Tutor, specifically designed to build lessons in courseware on Plato. And so they elected to go with that because it was something they could train the instructors and the TAs pretty easily in. It was pretty simple to learn. It had commands in it that were pretty advanced, like one of them allowed you to do judging on an answer. That was groundbreaking. I have never seen anything like that since in any compiler. It could handle you could handle, exact match. So you could give, if it was a numerical answer, you could have it look for an exact match. You could do a multiple choice. That was no problem. And you could do fill in the blank, which was a problem because it is possible you may have one or more answers that might be correct for that blank. The judge command had a facility that allowed you to say, okay, this word list, any of these is correct. Anything other than those would be incorrect. The other thing it allowed to do was to do long answer. So in that case, you gave a list of words and you said, well, they needed to have 5 of those 20 words somewhere in the description. And if I found those, you can give full credit to that answer. If they only had 4, then maybe you give partial credit, right, for that answer and so forth until they didn't have any, and then you gave them it was completely wrong. But so that was some of the things that were invented around this in order to start supporting building lessons online. There was other problems that they ran into as well. So they quickly grew into 146 locations. 26 were on campus. There was probably others too, but the Plato 5 quickly grew to about 950 terminals. What the heck does this have to do with having technologies that grew into what we use today? Well, Searle was it was a freewheeling place. You didn't need permission to do something. If you saw a problem, just fix it. Whatever you needed to do, just fix it. So the first problem that they ran into, of course, was teachers needed the ability to be able to contact students to see, I got this, or the student needed a mechanism to contact the teacher. Hey, I'm stuck. I don't know how to solve this problem. So the first thing they tried to do, there was a notes application that was written that allowed people to post into, I think, 3 different categories at first, and later it expanded to more. And then you had to wait for an answer. Well, some of these lessons were timed. You had so many minutes to complete the lesson from the start to the finish, or you failed it. So yeah, and you'd have to go back and retake it. I don't know how many times they would allow you to read. Some, it depended upon the course, but some of them were definitely timed. So you needed a little bit more immediacy than waiting for the teacher to get online to answer your question. They also had the ability so that you didn't have to submit your questions so that everybody read how dumb you were. So instead of doing that, they had a version called P-Notes, which was a smaller version of it that acted like email. So you could send a message off, and then when they got online, they would answer you. And then when you logged in next, you would see a note that said, hey, you've got P-Notes here and from so-and-so. They would tell you what you had. But that still wasn't going to be good enough. So they wanted to be able to get a hold of either the teacher or the TAs or whoever was assigned to be the mentor for these classes. And so the Plato authors developed something called Talkomatic. Talkomatic allowed up to, I think, 16 people. My memory's a little fuzzy, so somebody out there may go, "Oh no, it was 12." Well, whatever it was, that allowed for that many people to be on the screen at the same time, which looked a lot like a modern Zoom call. So, except that instead of having people borrow from the same real estate, everybody got a chunk of the screen. So yeah, I might be up here, you might be here, the next person might be in the middle. But we could all start typing and we didn't have to press enter or anything. We just, as we typed, it started to appear. Warts, mistakes, and all would appear. So everybody could read in real time what everybody was saying. Well, that was good, but again, you were out waving yourself out in front of the public, basically, with your ignorance, and so they invented Term Talk, which was a private version of that. So you could just talk to the person that you needed help from one-on-one without having to let the world know, because anybody could join a Talkomatic session. And frequently people did. The other thing is that Term Talk also there was a need for, well, I can't really see what the student's doing. I can't understand what his problem is. So they came up with a thing called monitor mode. And monitor mode could be initiated by whoever wanted to share their screen. So if I wanted to share a screen with you, I would initiate the monitor mode with you. If you wanted to share a screen with me, you had to initiate the monitor mode. And that was part of Plato's security, so that you couldn't just arbitrarily turn monitor mode on somebody's terminal and then spy on what they were doing. Because that in a test, when people were taking tests, and they took tests online, that would be a form of cheating, right? So they didn't allow that. A lot of the other thing that came about from all of this was multiplayer online games. It was just, first of all, it was a fun way to learn. I mean, there was classes that used games to teach concepts. Like there was one called Air Fight, and Air Fight was designed to teach students how to fly a plane. It had all of the controls. You could practice taking off and landing. And of course, yeah, if you got it wrong, you crashed, but you didn't die. So, and you didn't have to pay for the plane. You didn't have to pay for the instructor or the gas or any of that stuff. You could just go and work in the simulator. And it was close enough to the controls that a lot of them were using that game to learn how to fly. There were actually courses there was actually a pilot training class that was given by the university out at one of the airstrips. So the students would use that to gain the skills. Well, as all things happen, somebody wants to fight somebody, and so they added the ability to turn on dogfight mode. And then you could choose whatever fighter you wanted, and then you could start dogfighting your opponent. And I remember if you looked at in the early days of Flight Simulator when it was offered for DOS, if you looked at the two screens together, if you looked at Air Fight and you looked at them, they looked identical to me. And I think I don't think they copied it, but I think that what they did do is they were inspired by the way it looked, and they recreated the look and feel. Now, of course, Flight Sim is nothing like the wireframe. Yeah, our graphics were wireframe. Because we didn't have the bandwidth or the computing power to do filled models. I mean, that came later. Imagine all of this computation is being done on the server because the terminals are dumb. They didn't even have a processor in them until Plato 5. And then they got an 8080. I think it was an 8080A, 8080A. And those were limited. They, 8-bit. And they had 8K of memory, I think was it on the terminals. I don't remember them being able to add more, but that was it. You could run programs locally on it. but and people did. There was Dungeon and Dragons games. There was Empire, which I think caused more people to flunk out of the college than any other single game. It was a game where it was a Star Trek like game. There were 4 factions. I'm trying to remember: Federations, Orions, Romulans, and Klingons. Klingons, they changed the name to something because they were afraid of being sued by Paramount. So, yeah, they were a little concerned about that. So I don't know, for some reason they wanted to change the name of them. Probably the most notable problem to solve was, how do I get information about what's going on? What's new? What's new in the language? What's new on Plato? How do I know what new things I can use in my lessons? And so a newspaper was born. The problem what you have with any kind of notes-based, like discourse, for example, is that eventually everything scrolls offline, or it gets so deep that you can't find it anymore. You get on a really busy system, and it doesn't take long for your message to be buried, and you'll never find it again. So the newspaper was meant to be a place where people could publish articles that would stick around for a couple of days. And that was run by Bruce Perello. Bruce Perello had two things that he always did. First, he always wore red sweaters. He always drank orange Fanta soda. I think that's right. Yeah, orange Fanta, I'm pretty sure, was what he drank. Just before graduation, they banded together with some of the other miscreants from the author's lab, and they got the keys from his roommate, I think, to his apartment, broke into it, got to his clothes closet, took out all of his red sweaters, and I think they either left him a gold one or they put a gold one in there. And then they went to the soda machines and emptied out all the orange Fanta and replaced it with Grape Knee High or something. I don't remember. It was something like that. So that day that he came in, he was wearing a gold sweater and he didn't have his orange Fanta. So he was one depressed puppy. And so they let that go on for a while. People were teasing him about it all day. But yeah, there was just that kind of that camaraderie in there. The people would get into arguments all the time about some of the most nerdy things you can imagine. And we called those flame wars. They would erupt usually in the notes application or the notes lesson. And people would flame each other for hours, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, one of the moderators would have to put a stop to it by closing down the notes conversation. I don't remember it ever getting to blows, but, some of the problems that we see today where, people get a little bit more emotional when they're on a more or less anonymized. They say things they would never say to your face, right? Plato was the inventor of, what did they do? They invented the time-sharing file operating system. They also invented the graphical user interface. I know a lot of people say Xerox PARC, but Xerox PARC came to us. And they got some code from us, one of which was the character editor, which we used to design fonts. All of the fonts, all the terminals on the display. So all the fonts that were displayed were built by the people that needed that particular font. So you could have multiple fonts, as many fonts on the display as you wanted. You also had a special font that would take multiple characters, multiple computer characters, and marry those into a image map. So you actually had an image map where you could change pieces of it. Like if you wanted the feet to move, you could automate, you could create 3 or 4 different positions of the feet and then send them in rapid succession to create an animation. They also had the technology that updated only what had changed, and that was pretty radical for the 60s. Nobody had thought of that, and I don't remember seeing anybody trying to do that again until about the 80s and early 90s. Other thing is that, we had the multi-user note system, which would be the forerunners to Discourse and some of the other chat rooms. You also had personalized messaging, so that would be the same as being able to message. We also had emojis, which is something that Bruce Perello, the Red Sweater, again invented, and that was to allow people to make single character comments on messages that were posted, either in response to articles on the newspaper or in response to notes, and that got incorporated into the system. So emojis also came out of that. So you can blame Plato for that. We did it first. The other thing it was, of course, you had monitor mode, and then you had the different talk. So we had basically Zoom calls without the camera and the voice. There was two lessons that I learned from this. The first one was there's no such thing as an unsolvable problem. It's just the ability for you to, in order to solve unsolvable problems, you need to be taught in a different way. Typically, most subject matter today, and even back then, was taught by subject matter only. So you were tested, you got the answers in the back of the book for the problems that they were concentrating on in teaching you how to solve. But that doesn't solve all problems. Synthesis education is what Dr. Bitzer believed in. And that was the reason why he was able to solve the unsolvable problems, is because synthesis education requires knowledge in many areas like chemistry, physics, mathematics, electrical engineering, and yes, maybe even mechanical engineering, maybe even a little material science. But the more you have in your toolbox, the more you can draw on to solve problems. His secret was he had knowledge in a lot of different areas. So he could draw from a vast storehouse of knowledge to solve problems that other people had failed at that were still working on them for 2 years. And he came in and he'd look at the problem and then he would solve it like within a couple of days. He was a lot of fun to work with. He enjoyed technology. He enjoyed working with young people. He challenged us. He didn't give us requirements. He didn't say, I need you to develop this system in this way. No, he didn't do it that way. The way he did it was, this is the problem. I need you to solve it. I don't care how you do it. If you get stuck, come back, we'll talk about it. That is just the way he was. That is exactly the way he was. And that way of learning was he tried to keep his hands off as much as he could unless you asked for his help. And then he would come in and help. The other thing I learned was never stop learning. Things change too fast, and if you want to be able to solve problems, you need all the pieces you can get your hands on to do it. So if you want to become a problem solver, I'm not sure that I have ever reached the pinnacle of Dr. Bitzer, but I try, and it does take work on your part, and stay up with it. I've heard. So with that, thanks for watching. See you next time. In the meantime, check out some of my other videos. I'll put a couple of them up here for you.